Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about multiplying integers. To get started, I want you guys to open up your math notebook to page 53, which is where we have our vocabulary. On page 53, I want you guys to find the vocabulary word product, which is going to be the first one we're talking about today. Now, the product simply is the answer to a multiplication problem. I want you guys to write these examples with me in your math notebook. So if I take a look at 4 times 6, and notice I use the multiplication dot here, I would get a product of 24. Now what's cool is this week we're going to be talking about how to multiply positive and negative numbers. So let's take a look at this one. If I have -4 times a -6, I also get a product of 24. So these right here, my answers, are what we call the product. Now the other word we need to talk about today is the multiplication property of 0. Now this simply just says that the product, that means the answer of a multiplication problem, of any number and 0 is going to be 0. For example, if I do 4 times 0, I get 0. If I have -4 times 0, I'm still going to get 0 because the product of any number times 0 will always be 0. Please make sure that you have these examples in your math notebook. And then we are going to be turning to page 56 where we're going to look at some examples. At the top of page 56, you should see something that looks like this. Now this is what we call a tic-tac-toe board because it looks like a tic-tac-toe board. And the tic-tac-toe board lets us look at the rules for multiplying integers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to put plus signs going down diagonally. There's like my 3 in a row in my tic-tac-toe. Now these plus signs represent positive integers. Then what you're going to do is you're going to fill in the rest of your tic-tac-toe board with negatives, which guess what? They represent negative integers. Now what's really nice about this is if we read our tic-tac-toe board across, it tells us all the rules. So the only rule it doesn't tell us is what a positive times a positive is. And the reason it doesn't tell us that is because you should know that a positive times a positive is a positive, because that's what you've been doing since elementary school. Now if I read the top row here, this says a positive times a negative equals a negative. So I can fill that in right here. A positive times a negative is a negative. This next column says a negative, I'm going to put that here, a negative times a positive equals a negative. Then we can look at the last rule down here which says a negative times a negative equals a positive. So what I want you guys to notice is if you look very closely, you will see that when you have the same signs, like a positive times a positive and a negative times a negative, you are always going to get a positive answer, which is what I want you to fill in right here. Then if you look when our signs are different, a positive times a negative and a negative times a positive, we got negative products or answers. Now the tic-tac-toe board can just kind of help us remember these rules, and you'll kind of get used to them over time. So let's take a look at some examples. Whenever I start doing multiplication, the first thing you'll see me do is sketch a tic-tac-toe board, because the number one mistake that people make is that they get the rules for multiplying and adding mixed up, and we want to make sure we keep those very separate. Now you don't need to redraw this necessarily because you can still see it at the top of your page. I just wanted to make sure we have it to refer to. So we're going to look at the odd problems together. So if I take a look at this, this is a negative times a positive. the first thing I'm going to do before I multiply is decide what my answer should be. And if I look at a negative times a positive, my product should be a negative. Then we just multiply like normal. 4 times 3 is 12. If I go to number 3, I see a negative times a negative. And again, I'm going to look to see what my answer should be. If I look at my tic-tac-toe chart, I see a negative times a negative equals a positive. So I don't need to worry about that. And I can just do 5 times 6 is 30. Now, yesterday, we were talking about groups when we were doing our Desmos activity. So remember on number 1, this means the opposite of 4 groups times 3. So we have 4 times 3 is 12, and the opposite of that would be negative 12. When we look at this one, this says the opposite of 5 groups of negative 6. Well, yesterday when you did that Desmos activity, you saw that 5 groups of negative 6 makes negative 30, but we need to take the opposite of that. Now, you can use those rules we learned in Desmos, or you can use the tic-tac-toe chart. What's important is you understand what these mean and that you do the strategy that works best for you. So let's look at number 5. This says this says 2 times negative 14, which means 2 groups of negative 14. So thinking back of that Desmos activity, you would be making a group of 14 to the left and then another group of 14 to the left. Or we can look at our tic-tac-toe board. I have a positive times a negative, which is going to give me a negative. Either way I look at this, I'm going to have a negative answer. And then 2 times 14 is just 28. Lastly, we have 12 times 0. Now on this one, I don't have to think anything about it because we talked about the multiplication property of 0, which says a number times 0 is always going to be 0. Now, before we stop the video, I want us to look at the bottom of page 56 where we have multiple factors. So there is a shortcut that you could learn, and I'll go over it briefly, but we're going to kind of focus on the meaning more. That if you have an even number of negatives, you are going to have a positive answer. And yes, I want you to write this with me. And if I have an odd number of negatives, I'm going to get a negative answer. So let's check this out. I can use my shortcut first. I see 1, 2 negatives. 2 is an even number, so I should end up with a positive answer. But we can try to prove this by only working with 2 factors at a time. So we're going to start with doing negative 5 times 2. Remember, this means the opposite of 5 groups of 2. Well, 5 times 2 is 10, and the opposite of 10 would be a negative. Again, if you need to, you could also use our tic-tac-toe board. There we go. And you would see a negative times a positive is a negative. Now I'm going to bring down my negative 3, and this now says negative 10 times negative 3, or the opposite of 10 times negative 3. Well, 10 times negative 3 would be a negative 30, and the opposite of a negative is a positive. The other way you can look at it is a negative times a negative is a positive. Last example I'm going to do with you, if we take a look at number 2, it says negative 2 times negative 4 times negative 5. Well, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. 3 is an odd number, so that means I'm going to get a negative answer. We can break it down, though, to check it out. Negative 2 times negative 4 is really saying the opposite of 2 times negative 4. So the opposite of a negative 8 would be a positive 8. Again, we could look at our rules. Negative times a negative is a positive. Then I'm going to bring down my negative 5, and I'm going to multiply 8 times negative 5, which means 8 groups of negative 5. And that means I'm going to be, if you think about a number line, here's 0, here are my negative numbers. I'm going to show 8 groups of negative 5, so my answer should be getting more negative, and I would get 8 times 5 is 40. Again, the shortcut would be to look at a positive times a negative is a negative. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to finish up the examples on page 56, and then you will be following the directions from your substitute. I hope you guys are doing a very nice job, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.